This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host.
Welcome everyone. This is the Meaningful Sport podcast, and I am your host, Noora Ronkainen. Meaningful Sport is a series of discussions on the why and how involvement in sport and physical activity can be an important part of a life worth living. If you are interested in the theme, you might also want to check out meaningfulsport.com. There you can find podcast show notes, read a blog, and access many resources for further explorations of meaningful sport. Welcome back to the second part of our episode on spirituality in sport. Today's interview is done by Olli Tikkanen, and we are discussing the spiritual dimension of sport together with Dr. Mark Nesti. Our conversation draws on the book we have written together with Mark, titled Meaning and Spirituality in Sport: Psychological Perspectives. In the first part, we discussed some trends on how spirituality is understood in contemporary Western culture and the challenges researchers face when trying to define and study the construct. Today, we explore the ways that the spiritual dimension has been studied in sport research, talk a bit about the interest on mindfulness in sport psychology, and both of us discuss their favorite topics of our book, which for Mark is applied sport psychology practice, and for me, aging, spirituality and sport. I hope you enjoy today's discussion.
If we move forward and go to that, where are we now in research on spirituality? Noora, would you like to start on this one?
So briefly, in the book we were looking at the trajectory of the study of spirituality, and I think some of the earlier work we have these fascinating studies on peak experience, flow. I think some of the early work on flow also had this spiritual or religious dimension. Mark, you've written about that more than I have, but so flow was something that probably became more secular and more also used as a kind of how to enhance performance, and those questions took over the interest instead of kind of what is the spiritual element of flow. And so we have these different studies on runner's high, flow, peak experience. Some would talk about mystical experiences that I talked about as well. And so another strand is this study of Zen, and there are these popular books about the Zen zone and the Zen of tennis and golf and these kind of things. So certainly what we touched upon already, that kind of Eastern spirituality is probably something that is, for many people, it's easier to think about that as something that there are these principles that are relevant to people regardless of what is their religion and so forth. And so I think those were the earlier studies really. But so what we see, some of the movements now, for example, Mark's work has really lifted to the forefront that when you are working with athletes who have a spiritual or religious worldview, you need to understand that worldview in order for you to be able to work with them effectively. And the strand called cultural sport psychology is also very much lifting to the forefront that athletes are not just athletes, but they are people, and they will have their spiritual beliefs and religious beliefs, and they have their different cultural backgrounds, and all these things are very relevant when you are working with different athletes, especially now that in terms of transnationalism of sports. So in a lot of sport teams, and Mark will certainly talk more about this, you will have a lot of athletes who are from a different cultural background from your own, and also the Western perspective is not the dominant one, or the secular perspective is certainly not the dominant one when we look into things in a global scale. So those are some of the things that we see. And I think one thing I like to talk about is mindfulness, which is a big boom. But I think I'll now hand over to Mark, so maybe you have a few remarks on those things, and then we can talk about mindfulness a little bit.
It's funny, Noora, as you were speaking there, one of the things I just scribbled down to make sure that I tie that into this answer, so I will delay this, was mindfulness, which is having its moment, which is so unfortunate that sports psychology does this with such excellent and useful ideas that have already been there before, and then they have their moment, and then by definition, when you have your moment, means eventually you won't have your moment, and then it disappears. And we move on to something else. So let's give mindfulness a bit of attention in a minute. Before we get to there, just pick up on some of the things that you've mentioned. You've covered a lot of really important things there. And probably in terms of research, it has been not easy, but easier to look at, if you like, the idea of, as athletes would describe it, and coaches, of being in the zone. So the well-known idea, particularly at high-level sport, whatever the sport is, but actually at high-level performance right across the domain, whether it's music, art, drama, surgery, writing books, making your tea, it doesn't matter what you're doing. This strange phenomenon, which is phenomenologically derived, in other words, it's come from the lived experience, real life. It's like, so tell me what you're thinking when you're actually at your very best. And this strange apparent paradox to which the usual reply is nothing. And then if you push a little bit harder, as I always do, and never let anybody get away with that one, and they usually say, well, just the thing that I'm doing now, which of course is the answer across so many different domains. And I think, there's plenty of literature to suggest that it's pretty universal. So what are we talking about? We're talking about something that is really quite remarkable. You spend all this time training your mind and your body to perfect some amazing techniques that will require you to be in the best physiological and physical condition, and with confidence, and perfected these techniques to use them in the right place. And then, paradoxically, they are best delivered when apparently you're not there. You being essentially your conscious mind and your awareness of your body. In other words, you perform at your very best when you have, if I could use this expression, when you've left yourself, which is very strange. Strange or not, that's how human beings appear to be. And that's really interesting. Now, that's been described as flow in the work of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and he describes that in very rich detail, and how we can make that more likely rather than not. He ties it into performance, optimal performance, but interestingly, he also ties it into health. That's psychological and physical and spiritual health. And in his later books, he actually, I think, for me, goes too far, but I can see why he's tempted. He actually says that this is where happiness resides. And he actually then takes another step, and I seem to think that he's suggesting that almost the meaning of life is to live in this, let's call it a time, somebody else has said this before, but a time when there is no history. So you have no future thoughts, and you have no thoughts about the past. All you're thinking about is the thing that's immediately in front of you. And that's a remarkable thing when you spent so much time to apparently prepare to do things that are coming down the line in front of you. So all that work on flow, the zone, fantastic research there. Unfortunately, a lot in sports psychology has not been, I think, as consistent with the underpinning philosophy and phenomenological psychology of his work, and has tried to quantify that, and has measured flow in relation to other quantifiable constructs. And as a consequence, we've got something there, but I think it's limited. So this has huge implications for research methods, or should I say methodology, more accurately, and understanding the value of qualitative research. So this area seems to be one where qualitative research and qualitative methodology would be key. And just the final thing that you mentioned before we go, mindfulness, Nora, was the applied work. So it's true, many individuals who speak convincingly about the importance of the spiritual side in their work as sports psychologists are people who've had a lot of practice. They also have a particular background, and maybe they reflect and thought very carefully. But they're used to actually, hearing terms that and describing athletes describing experiences that do not fit neatly into some of the existing constructs that you'd find in sports psychology. And so I think what's going to be interesting is I hope future researchers will take some of those words, some of those ideas, concepts, and drive them back into theory and consider what theory in psychology at the moment can accommodate those, can make more sense. So, in other words, let the words from the ground change the theory. It shouldn't be science and theory that changes reality. It's the other way, in certainly this particular example here. And then maybe the second part of that research would be, and what are the implications of this for, one, what we teach in sports psychology, what we expose our students to, how we train and educate them. And obviously part of that is the implications for applied practice. What actually should we be doing and how should we be doing that? So I'll stop now, Nora, that's enough there, and I'm sure you want to come back to mindfulness eventually.
Yeah, I mean, when we are talking about the trends and what is going on in sports psychology and spirituality, I think we should definitely touch upon mindfulness. The interesting thing is that we've done a little bit of reviewing that work with some colleagues, like after writing the book. And if you are looking for literature on spirituality, the mindfulness studies don't come up at all because they don't use the word spirituality at all in these studies. So what you see in sports psychology is that mindfulness is taken as a completely secular concept. So it's not discussed in relation to Buddhism at all. It's not discussed in relation to spirituality at all. But it seems to be a lot more about secular technique, which is focused on being present in the moment. And there's a very interesting paper by Mark Anderson that was recently published in the Journal of Sports Psychology in Action, and he's looking at these Eastern and Western perspectives on identity and the Buddhist idea of no self, and he's just taking it up that we have so many of these mindfulness studies now in sports psychology, and they are very fashionable at the moment, but almost none of these studies are trying to link that to the original Buddhist goal of realizing the no self as is part of that spiritual tradition. And outside of sports psychology, there are so many of these critical commentaries and so many of these worries that are being voiced that kind of mindfulness easily becomes just a self-help technique that has like no connection to ethics, and just these questions that if you just take a technique and you completely divorce it from the philosophical and spiritual tradition where it came from, and these questions that is it ethical and is it actually going to help people if it's done that way. But I think in sports psychology we are certainly not discussing this enough. We are not discussing this almost at all.
Well, this might be a little bit melodramatic to say this, but it could almost make you cry. This, in some ways, is wonderful to see because of what Nora just said in terms of the grounding of this approach, certainly. And I know the Anderson writing that she's referring to, and he makes the very correct point that this is something that is associated with and derived from Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, and encouraging people and doing more than that to go and have a look at the grounding. And so that's all very wonderful and very exciting, but but unfortunately, and I have to say this, I know it sounds rather negative, but unfortunately, whilst the culture of sports psychology typically And some of the reasons behind this maybe we should talk about to give a balanced view, but typically is still associated with quick fix and a quick fix mentality, and that something has to be effective, and we need to be able to measure it, and it needs to be an intervention, and it's all of that language, which is fundamentally language from the natural sciences, which is language from physics, and has its place in psychology, as we've said, but it's a small place. It shouldn't be the entirety of our discipline. It's such an error, phenomenologically speaking. It does not connect to the full reality of working, particularly when you're doing work with real human beings in real situations. So in terms of mindfulness, what an opportunity to look at something from a countercultural perspective. When the Western culture for such a long time now has been about speed, ease, quickness, whereas what we're talking about here, spirituality, and this is another one of the deeper reasons why currently in the West it is so unfashionable, is this will take time. It will never be complete. You can talk about it and try and assess where you are, and that's meaningful to one level. But this will never be something you can reduce to something that is neat, clear, and tidy. This is not about cause and effect. It's not even almost about correlation. This is something beyond that. And so to understand this, I think, from an academic point of view, I would love our psychologists to spend much more time studying some philosophy to understand the different philosophical perspectives that underpin their psychological view. And then they decide. Then it's a free world. You decide where you are. But understand the limitations of what you've got. So mindfulness could have been, and I hope it might still be, but any sign of it yet, something much more than a technique. Somebody said this, I wish it had been me, but somebody said, in the end, technique eventually undermines technique. And there's lots in that statement. And one of the things in that statement is that technique is almost like in medicine using something to deal purely with symptoms. The underlying causes, the real, if you like, explanation of what's going on must be part of the cure, if we wanted to put those words. That's not the appropriate language for us. So it's really depressing to see mindfulness just being used as some kind of flashy, quick fix technique. And what's worse is it again makes sports psychology, in the eyes of some people, you can understand why, appear to be that it's just this collection of these quick techniques that are barely grounded in anything. And what a missed opportunity that is. And I think that maybe, again, the higher level athletes, many higher level athletes have already been through so many challenges and struggles and exciting moments and all of the other things that they face. But the level of commitment, the intensity that's demanded to be really good at whatever it is you're doing, usually means that you're suspicious of something that is easy and quick. Sometimes it is the appropriate thing, but very often it's not, and you've learned that through your life. So what a chance with mindfulness to actually broaden it out, to show that it's actually part of, as you said, Noora, something that's much deeper, that actually could be described and is more properly described as something that is grounded in a spiritual view. And so that's certainly where I am. I certainly think it's really, really valuable. I think it's excellent that it's there, but I really fear that it's having its moment and it's viewed as just another technique, almost like imagery or relaxation strategies.
Yeah, I'm on the same page with that, and I mean, certainly not saying that this is all terrible and it should not happen. Like, it's certainly that we are drawing on Eastern traditions and we are trying to understand some of that, and how it can help us understand the way we are in sport is a very valuable striving. But and at the same time, I'm certainly not an expert in Zen Buddhism. Like, I've done my own readings as much as I can, but one of the problems I think also in this literature is that it's almost exclusively Western scholars' interpretation. So I think in this debate and this dialogue, we should have a lot more scholars who are also grown up in these traditions, and to have their perspectives much more often in the literature as well. And that's hopefully something that is going to happen more often in the future. But so maybe it's good time to move on. So I'll hand it to Olli. We can be talking the whole day, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Nora. I think it was a really good critique about mindfulness, and it's really reductionistic, and if you try to reduce Zen to something, you are probably going the wrong way. But like said, if we move on, so in your books you have covered a diverse array of things, including health, motivation, injury, aging, and applied sports psychology, among other things. So please choose your favorite topic or theme and share some thoughts on that. Mark, would you like to go first on this one?
Well, I suppose the one that I have had most interest in, and the reason why I've experienced is the applied aspect. I know we've discussed that in most of these bits of the dialogue between us so far, but that is probably where I'm still most interested, and there's a few reasons for that, and one of them is to put it in more sort of traditional language. I have seen this in action, and I've seen its importance. Or if you want to be even more narrow, I've seen it work. And that doesn't sound at all inconsistent with what we've just been saying about spirituality, and that this is not something that is to be approached to get instantaneous results, and it's not about cause and effect. But as I say, that's been an impetus to me, is actually to being able to sit down with athletes from different sports over all these years, in the last 33, 34 years, and from a range of different sports. And as I often say, absolutely not everybody, for a whole host of different reasons. And this includes athletes of different ages and sex and performance, success, and a whole host of different factors you could drop in there, and culture. And yet hear them talking about words, using words, describing themselves in terms that cannot be fully accounted for by the more reductionist theoretical perspectives in psychology. And by that I mean behaviorism and cognitive psychology in particular. And it's not that those areas do not have some value, they most certainly do. But I'm talking about having encounters with athletes and hearing what we've just been talking about now. And let me be very explicit. Here's one in the last few years, and I won't narrow it down more than that, because I would hate anybody to put two and two together. They'll probably get the wrong person. But this person described how it was a long journey for them through a number of crises moments. This is a very, very, very high level performer. And that they eventually learned that the techniques that they were using to attempt to, as it were, remove themselves from the picture so they could be the full person out there and get into the zone more often, and when they weren't in the zone, remain performing at good level, that it took crises moments. It took various moments, both within sport and also outside of sport, illness in the family, all sorts of difficulties and challenges, for them to reassess and then reevaluate and reassess again, and come to the situation that Nora so eloquently described, where they understood that to focus on results and to use techniques to stop themselves focusing on results would bring performances that were not as good and not sustained, or certainly over the longer term, and actually undermine their joy and happiness and sense of purpose in what they were doing. And we're talking professional, high-level professional sport here. And that it took a long time for them to get to this place. And they described this place as somewhere where they viewed whatever the result was a gift. All the work that they had to do, and they knew they had to do, could not guarantee anything. In other words, they had managed to get to a very, very high level of disassociating themselves with the outcome, with the result. And I explained this to a few people over the years, and they've said, I can't believe this. It's incredulous. How could somebody not care about the result if they're a top level performer? It's like, no, listen carefully. They deeply care about the result before they do something. They deeply care about it afterwards. But they prepared themselves so that when they're actually doing it, they're not considering the result at all. And they're not expecting that to happen. Their focus, interestingly, is what a lot of sports psychologists would say, and a lot of sports psychology literature has said over the years. Their focus was on purely controlling their own performances, their own processes, and expecting nothing in return. Well, that took, according to this person, that took them between 5 and 6 years to get reasonably close to that place. So for me, I think in terms of applied implications, the applied implications of this would be, I'm really, really disappointed that our sports psychology profession, to a large extent, not in all cases, still is not as countercultural as it should be. It should be the discipline that's countercultural in the sense of asking, helping, supporting people to take time, to take as much time as they possibly can, even if they're in a very fast-moving, highly demanding place where it appears you need to perform brilliantly every time and certainly the next time. And so to actually do what we often pronounce as psychologists, which is to take the time to understand something fully. In ordinary English, we would say, maybe in today's world, certainly in sport language, we would say to own something fully yourself. And that usually takes time and struggle. And that's not a weakness of the sports psychologist, and it's certainly not a weakness of the athlete. And so I think that this topic has the potential, this area has the potential to be countercultural and to help both with performance and well-being, and will suggest that actually we move far, far too quickly on far too many things, and that this is one of the ways to achieve, and one of the best ways to achieve, sustained high-level performance, which will bring some moments of deep joy. So that's where I am. It's the applied world, really, for me, Ollie. It always really was, and it's kind of gone full circle. And I'd love other people to come in, and much better researchers than me who have got much more interest than that in that topic. And maybe that's where I should hand over to Noora, because I know she's a very, very highly skilled researcher.
Yeah, I think a good thing for me here is to broaden our discussion. So you are certainly an expert in terms of your applied practice in the elite and professional sport context. I think the part that I was bringing into our book was more about the role of sport, for example, in later life. So, and I have been a bit more of recreational sport or non-elite sport researcher and certainly participant as well. And so for me, one of the topics maybe to take from the book that I'd like to discuss for a couple of minutes is the topic of aging. And I think from spiritual perspective, that's highly interesting, because spirituality is one of the very few dimensions of human life that we actually often think about as something that is increasing or growing when you are getting older. So, for example, if we think about your athletic abilities or your physical performance, that's something that declines when you get older. And I mean, we can talk about cognitive decline, and we can talk about all sorts of decline when you get older. But spirituality is something that we often talk about spiritual growth when we get older. And I think that's really fascinating to look into older athletes and the meaning they find in sport, and how meaning in sport shifts when athletes get older. And as part of my PhD research, we did this study with Mark and Tatiana Riba, where we looked at stories of runners who'd been in high level, they'd been competing in national and international level. And when they were getting older, they encountered this existential dilemma, like, is it worth continuing to run if I'm not getting any faster anymore? That I'm a little bit slower than the year before, and next year I'm probably going to be slower than this year. Is there a point to run anymore? And then some of these runners were then talking about this reflections, maybe this growing spiritual dimension of running that they were experiencing. And this is something that comes up in some of my later work as well. So aging is something that forces us to think about the meaning of sport in our life when it's not maybe possible to always be climbing up the ladder of achievement anymore. So is it still worth for us to keep doing that when we are getting older? It was a nice way. There was a little popular story in the Runner's World magazine about that study we did with Mark and Tatiana, and the title was something like why reading Sartre might help you more than constantly chasing new personal records. And that was about when you are getting older, you need to be thinking about meaning of sport and whether it's worthwhile for you to continue your involvement. So yeah, those are some of the things that I've continued working on. I'm fascinated with these things. I'm 35 now, so as an athlete, as a sport participant, it's funny to think that I'm actually getting a little bit old. And so it's also a personal reflection. I can now compete in the Masters athletics if I want to. I'll see whether I go for that. But yeah, that's a fascinating topic for me.
Yeah, thanks. Do you want to add something, Mark?
Yes, I think it's, even though Noora led on that topic in the book and did a fantastic job, and I think she's not going to say this, so I will, that she's opened up so many really interesting areas for researchers as well as theorists and applied practitioners to pursue. But since we were talking about research, lots of potential avenues to go down. And I think it's one of the chapters in the book that can do that. And I think it's a great point to make that this topic is not just about, and most certainly not just about elite level athletes. This is about everyone, and certainly about later stages of life and later stages of sporting lives. And just a couple of things on that. I've mentioned Jung 3 times. That's probably more than I thought I was going to, but why not? Because at least Jung, unlike Freud, had a very interesting perspective on spirituality and had much to say about spirituality and religion, and is one of the great psychologists after all. And he said that mid-age, he said that was 40 in his days. I hope it's much older than that, given how old I am. But that at middle age is the absolute key moment in the development of an individual's personality. That's how he expressed it. In that you either become a more spiritual person, and then he elaborates what that actually means, or you regress. In other words, you don't stay still, you regress. And you regress to something else. So that's quite stark. That's quite a warning. It's interesting. It's worthy of thought. And I think that has real relevance for sport, in that as your physical prowess and maybe even to some degree your psychological capacities begin to decline, why do I at 60, 61 I am now, why do I still play quite poor tennis? Why do I still try and play five-a-side football with people 35 years younger than me? Why do I do as I've just done, go out for a long cycle ride? Why am I doing all these things? To what end? Because I'm certainly not getting any quicker or faster or better in narrow performance terms. And I think there's lots of ways of describing that. And one of the ways, which is what we were trying to do in the book, is to say that this links into meaning. And to make that more explicit, in my terms and some of the literature we've drawn on, that means identity. And it's an account of how I see myself. And it's most certainly not, it never was, but it most certainly not narrowly defined in terms of some external view of performance. A way to describe it would be it's me against me, which of course there are spiritual traditions, religious and non-religious, in the East and the West, who would say, but that's exactly a spiritual view. It's you against you. You trying to be a little bit better. Me at 61 trying to be a little bit better at the level of tennis that I play. Why? Because there's great enjoyment and there's a great opportunity to commit to something, to do something that brings the whole mind and body together in one unified whole, and everything disappears, at least for some seconds and sometimes for even longer. And that you bring the joy and satisfaction back into your life from something that when you reflect on it, nothing has been produced. You haven't, at my level, I certainly haven't made any money and won any awards. Nothing has been produced. And so in that sense, this is an encounter with art. In my view of what I experience, I am involved in art. This is a holistic experience. It doesn't mean, by the way, as I'm sure artists like sculptors would certainly tell you, that art does not involve strain, sweating, and hard work in narrow sense. Of course it does. But that's not its prime motive. Those are things that have to be done. So I think Noora's chapter on aging and understanding sport in a different way, and hearing those stories, because there are people who actually participate and we haven't listened to them, and not prejudging why they do something, and not coming up with superficial, simplistic accounts that it's purely to do with physical fitness. It may be that, but it very often is much, much more than that. And that, to me, is so important in so many different ways. And I'd hope there's lots of, research. If we're going to do any research that's fresh and new and tells us something different, what an avenue to follow.
And I guess just to very briefly follow up to that is that one of these things that we are addressing in the book is that yes, sport is something that can bring you achievement. Sport is something that can bring you better health as well. Like these are the common justifications of sport and exercise, but we are hoping to bring more awareness and hopefully more research in this area of how can sport be a meaningful part of people's lives. How can it bring more meaning to people and this spiritual dimension, and how sport can be in some ways also a spiritual practice for people.
Just to join in, Noora, with that last comment, I think you're absolutely right, and I think there's much that could be said there, and I think that in some cases, and I'm sure we will hear this, and to hear the accounts would be really interesting, how some people actually find that their spiritual encounters and almost awakening in their sport connects into their broader life, that they actually maybe develop a greater understanding of the spiritual and spirituality in life outside of sport, as it were. And so that, in this way, sport can be much more than just something that is about, as you quite rightly said, exercise and the physical and even the psychological in narrowly conceived, that actually it can touch other parts of your life and broaden your understanding of what it is to be a human being. And if that sounds very grand, and that sounds, overblown and exaggerated, then I think that that's not the case. And I'm looking forward to the research and the studies that will give us, accounts of and their own personal accounts of just what I've just described. And I'm quite sure that's there.
Yeah, so this has been really fascinating discussions and a lot to think about for everyone within sports. But I think we need to start wrapping up. So the name of the book is Meaning and Spirituality in Sport and Exercise: Psychological Perspectives. So if you're interested to learn more about these, check out the book. And thanks a lot, Noora and Mark, for taking the time for this podcast episode.
Thanks so much, Olli, for being the host today, and thanks, Mark. I really enjoyed our discussion, and even if we work together, I feel that there were again new perspectives and more things to think about. So yeah, thank you.
Same, Noora and Olli. Thanks for hosting that. It's not your discipline. I think you did a really good job, and you showed it can be done, even if you do not have the disciplinary background, again, in conventional terms. And so thank you very much for that. And I agree, Noora. I think there's lots and lots of fresh ideas that I'm sure, will take on, and that other people will. I look forward to seeing something emerge in the journals, particularly in the journals, in the next few years.
Yeah, thanks. This was fully my pleasure.
Thanks for joining us this week on Physical Activity Researcher Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing or following the show on Twitter. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. If you found value in the show, we would really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever app you're using. Or if you would, in a real old school way, simply tell a friend about the show. It would be a great help for us. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for forthcoming episodes, so be sure to tune in. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.